You know, if you were to ask me what my favorite spacecraft is, at least in terms of the kinds of inspiration that it gives me to go out into the solar system myself and to witness the most spectacular sights that human beings could possibly see, and certainly not on Earth, but in places like this, it would be the Mars Express and the images that it sent back to us over the course of nearly 20 years. And the Mars Express is just one example of many amazing technological achievements that the ESA has been able to pull off over the last several decades. They have really expanded our knowledge of the solar system and given us a lot of reason to be excited about striking out into the solar system and expanding the presence of the human species throughout all of these magnificent planets that orbit our sun. It's hard to pick a favorite image out of so many, but I think my favorite is probably this one, the Ecos-Cosma. And these cliff walls that you're looking at right now are 4,000 meters high. Think about that for a minute. Over 2 miles high. Can you imagine standing at the base of cliffs like that? There's nowhere on Earth that's even remotely like that. And Mars Express has given us a vision of such things like no other. But where the ESA has sadly failed is in the field of reusability. This Vega rocket, for example, is completely expendable, like just about everything else that the ESA launches. And it's just so unfortunate because there's so much innovation at the ESA. But unfortunately, there's a lot of government subsidy as well, which takes away a great deal of the incentive to make things reusable, to make them affordable, and to make them competitive. And as a result, the ESA has been lagging behind on reusability and making space affordable to the human race. But there are signs of life. The ESA has recently heavily invested in a reusable spacecraft called the Space Rider. Not quite a Dragon, not quite a Dream Chaser or a space plane, but something kind of similar. Very innovative, very exciting, but at the same time, a little bit disappointing. It's only one example of a number of things that the ESA is doing to try to embrace reusability. I applaud them for making the effort, but still, it may not be enough. But we're going to find out all about it in just a few moments. Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of the Angry Astronaut. Decided to take a couple of days before releasing another episode. Been churning things out really rapidly, and it's been taking a lot out of me, but it's definitely been worth it. The last 2 episodes that I've released have been my most popular yet, at least thus far. Especially the one about Blue Origin. I honestly can't believe it. Well over 100,000 views in less than 2 days. I have never come close to approaching anything like that. And I'm up to 35,000 subscribers, getting ever closer to the destruction of this mug. This mug, I think, thought that it was going to see the holidays, and maybe it still will. But with your help, maybe it won't. If you have the same opinion about Boeing that I do, help me blow this thing to bits and let's get to 40,000. But in the meantime, Let's talk about something that a lot of channels don't discuss, and that's the European Space Agency. What are they really doing? I mean, we talk about their contribution to Artemis and, other aspects of things that they do, the rockets that they send up, the satellites, but just about everything is unmanned. Well, I take that back. Everything is unmanned by them. And it's a source of incredible frustration to me because the European Union has an enormous amount of capital. They easily have the money to start their own manned space program, but instead they send up their astronauts on either Russian Soyuz or now on the Crew Dragon and maybe on the Boeing Starliner, which could potentially be the last mistake they'll ever make, at least if it continues to perform the way it performed in its last unmanned test. Now, I'm hoping that it doesn't do that because, after all, I value astronauts' lives. I don't value Boeing, but I certainly value these brave people, and I hope that Boeing does everything that's necessary to protect their lives because thus far, from the performance of the Starliner, it doesn't appear that they have. But I don't want to get off on that tangent. The ESA, what have they really been doing on their own? Well, believe it or not, they have their own space plane, something similar to the Dream Chaser, which you've heard me talk about a whole bunch of times, except they call it the Space Rider. And it is pretty neat. It is pretty innovative. I like it in many ways, and yet in many other ways, it really pisses me off because all it is an unambitious version of the Hermes space plane, which was designed to carry astronauts, whereas this isn't, and as far as I can see, it never will carry astronauts. It's just too small and too unambitious. Once again, the ESA is going towards the robotic approach and relying on the Russians and NASA to get their astronauts into orbit. Frankly, I'm sick of it, but still, the Space Rider is something that needs to be talked about because there are a lot of cool aspects to it. So let's get on that topic, and let's get on it right now. Now, like the Dream Chaser, which is manufactured by Sierra Nevada Corporation, this rocket, or rather this space plane, if we want to call it that, is being launched atop another rocket, which is called the Vega, an Italian-built rocket designed to carry very small payloads to orbit. However, it doesn't need to carry very large payloads because the Space Rider is far from a huge ship. The Space Rider only weighs in at about 3 metric tons, which is roughly the same as the NASA Gemini way back in the day, and of course, as I've suggested, it's unmanned. However, it is capable of carrying 800 kilograms into low Earth orbit, and all of the scientific experiments and communications equipment, anything else that you would want to do during a 2-month mission. That's right, this thing would stay in orbit for up to 2 months before it re-entered. Now that little module on the back is what provides the Space Rider with its thrust, and it's based on the Vega AVUM stage, and that uses an engine called the RD-843, which is built by the Ukrainians of all people. Yes, even they are involved in this project, and I find that to be a very cool thing. Let's get everybody in on the action. It can only generate about 540 pounds worth of thrust, but it doesn't have to. And by the way, as you can see, it's expendable, but it decelerates the module. It allows it to maneuver and to re-enter. And check it out, a parafoil system similar to what a skydiver would use, and certainly capable of handling the mass that the Space Rider has. So it uses this in order to be able to maneuver into position, and it lands just like a glider. So it's a combination of a skydiver and a glider. Very innovative, I think. Now, of course, it has yet to be tested, at least this one, but the previous version, the prototype that this was based on, has actually already been tested. And as you can see, it can land just about anywhere. And it can land under very gentle circumstances, which means that the experiments on board would be safe and secure. So the Space Rider, being as small as it is also pretty damn simple. It has this space for 800 kilograms worth of payload, and by the way, that includes a robotic arm used to deploy satellites or other experiments that are designed to leave the spacecraft or to retrieve other things from orbit. Now, the rest of the spacecraft is pretty much just for the landing system, for the avionics, and also for an extensive coolant system because the cargo bay is supposed to be climate controlled. That's right, the cargo bay is pressurized and designed to have an Earth-like quality to the interior, which begs the question, if you can put an Earth-like atmosphere inside it, then why can't you put astronauts? Even just one. Keep in mind that, as I said before, the Gemini was about the same size and the same weight as the Space Rider, and it carried 2 astronauts. Not comfortably, but at the same time, this vessel would not necessarily be designed for a long-duration journey. Maybe just up to the ISS, or perhaps to another space station, a commercial space station in low Earth orbit. Who knows? But they're not even trying. And this goes back to the Hermes spaceplane, which was designed to carry 3 astronauts back in the day. This was canceled back in the 1990s, and I'm still angry that it was, because this was a magnificent design. Yes, it was very similar to the space shuttle in a lot of respects, but smaller, designed just to carry passengers, and it could have worked. And had it worked, when the space shuttle was retired, American astronauts would not have had to go aboard Soyuz spacecraft. Instead, they could have been paying the ESA for access to the International Space Station, or perhaps a combination of both. What a prideful moment that would have been for the ESA. But instead, while the European Union was imposing economic sanctions against the Russians, European astronauts, and Americans for that matter, were exclusively dependent on the Russians to provide them with access to the ISS and to space in general. It's absurd. The Europeans could have changed all that if they just had the ambition to try for their own manned space program. Now, this is Samantha Cristoforetti, and she's a graduate of the U.S. Space Camp. As a matter of fact, her picture is plastered in so many places in Huntsville, you would think that she was an American astronaut. But she wasn't. She was European, although trained in America and flew on American spacecraft. How much of a difference in terms of pride might it mean to somebody like this if they were to fly to the ISS on an Italian-built rocket and a European-built ship? Yes, it would be unbelievably uncomfortable in something as small as the Space Rider, but I'm not convinced that something like that would be incapable of carrying a human passenger. After all, if it worked for Gemini, why can't it work for something like that? But wouldn't that pride come at an incredible cost? After all, the Vega is completely expendable. Therefore, would it not be way more expensive to put one astronaut up to the ISS or someplace else, as opposed to putting it on the Crew Dragon on a mostly reusable vessel? Well, by 2025, according to the ESA, Space Rider will be operating at a rate of $9,200 per kilogram, or $7.3 million for the entire 800 kilograms in the cargo bay. That is a hell of a lot less than the 50 or so million dollars per seat that they're charging, or rather that SpaceX is charging on the Crew Dragon to go to the ISS. Now, how is this possible? The Vega cannot be launched for $7 million. Well, the obvious answer would be more government subsidies. However, the Europeans are working on other innovative ways of reusing engines on rockets. And this one is not particularly new, but I find it to be one of my favorite methods, and it's called the Adeline. And it essentially detaches the engine from the rocket and then has it re-enter, except it's not going to use a parachute the way ULA reusable rocket engines are going to be used, but rather it has its own wings and its own propulsion, and it actually even uses propellers to guide it back to the landing strip. Now keep in mind, the vast majority of the cost of a rocket booster is its engines, so if you can save the engines, you save about 70% of the cost of the rocket. If you were to reduce the cost of a Vega launch by 70%, you're coming in at about $7 million, just like they're quoting. And watch this thing come in, using propellers and capable of landing on just about any airfield, and you don't need a helicopter to retrieve it. It's a very innovative, very efficient way of getting your engine back. The Europeans are working on it right now, and I think that they should be putting more effort into it. So, although this is extremely simplified, you put the engine onto a new booster and off it goes, ready to launch another space rider. So this could be a way of sending astronauts, at least maybe one at a time, but remember, Gemini carried two. So perhaps you could even send two astronauts for a total of $7 million. This makes it incredibly competitive with the Crew Dragon. But once again, is the ESA working on it? As far as we know, it isn't. And by the way, what you're looking at right now is footage from the IXV, or Intermediate Experimental Vehicle, which passed its tests with flying colors way back in 2015. This project has been in process for a very long time. It shows a lot of promise, especially in terms of transporting scientific payloads into orbit for long periods of time and then returning them safely to Earth. However, I think that the ESA is being too conservative, and they really need to explore manned spaceflight on their own instead of relying on the Russians and NASA exclusively, if for no other reason than the fact that Europe should have their own pride. They have their own astronauts who desperately want to go into orbit, and instead of waiting for a seat on one of our ships or on a Russian ship, they should have the opportunity to go up on one of their own. So I want to be perfectly clear on something. I don't hate the ESA. They have accomplished some amazing things. The Mars Express is my favorite Mars orbiter that has ever been sent there. They have grabbed some unbelievable images of Mars with that little orbiter that's been there forever and continues to function like a champion. It's an amazing piece of technology and has given us some astonishing scientific information, to say nothing of the compelling visuals. The ESA has done many, many amazing things and is making invaluable contributions to Artemis. But still, they're being way too conservative when we're talking about manned space flight, in my opinion. Look at the long stretch of time that went between the space shuttle and the Crew Dragon. During that time, if the Europeans had proceeded with the Hermes and actually had a manned spaceflight capability, that means the world would not have had to rely exclusively on the Russians, who can be fickle sometimes, in terms of providing transportation up to the ISS. we would have had an alternative. We would have had a choice. If things had gone south between the Western world and the Russians, there still would have been an opportunity. And this could very easily happen again. If something happens to the Crew Dragon, God forbid, some sort of malfunction, something happens with it, technology fails. It doesn't matter if it's SpaceX or somebody else, and they lose a capsule, they lose astronauts. NASA's going to spend a very long period of time investigating that, during which time we're not going to have any other alternatives, except maybe the Starliner, but I don't even really want to talk about that. But if the Europeans were to come up with their own manned spaceflight program, then we would have more alternatives. More manned spaceflight is better than less manned spaceflight. And the Europeans certainly have the financial, the technological ability, the innovative ability to create something like this. The Hermes is an excellent example of that, as you can see. And yet they canceled it. And they continue to rely on NASA and the Russians in order to provide their astronauts with a path to space. They're astronauts who are just as excited about going into space as anybody else, just as enthusiastic, just as full of dreams, and yet they are restricted by the number of seats that are available on the NASA and Russian spacecraft that they use. It doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. And it's time for it to change. So, once again, I don't want you guys, you European viewers, to think that I'm just slamming on the ESA here. As I say, they've accomplished a lot of really cool stuff. And they're continuing to move that way towards reusability, innovative ways, as you saw in the video, of reusing their engines, that sort of thing. I applaud the ESA for a lot of what they're attempting to do right now to keep up with the times. But when it comes to manned space flight, they are sorely lacking, and they really need to do something about it. So, if you like this kind of blunt commentary, well, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, whether it be this starship, which you may notice from time to time from Spaceship Mania. Remember to use Angry 10 in the when you buy it, you get a 10% discount as a result. Don't forget that. This is a nice little ship, and they do other things too, like the Crew Dragon here. Although you have to 3D print that yourself, but you don't have to do that with this. And there are many other ways to support this channel as well. It's not only my livelihood, it's my ability to travel. I want to see other places besides Huntsville and Cape Canaveral, which I've gone to so far. I want to see all of the privatized efforts that mankind is making towards getting us into space. And that's going to require that I travel as time goes on, and I'm not going to be able to do that without support. But all of that having been said, thank you so much for all of your support, all of the views, all of the new subscribers. I am beside myself with excitement. So until the ESA is finally ready to take that big step and actually put their own astronauts into space, because they have the ability to, and they should, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.